Senator Johnson, you want to take another round?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Greenstone, I have to admit, I was surprised you've done all this research and you weren't aware of that Lancet July 2021 article comparing deaths caused by heat versus cold. But let me give you another question here. In a previous hearing, I asked the witnesses whether they knew how much we'd already spent on climate change. You're saying there's a $6 or $7 benefit for every dollar spent. So first of all, do you know how much we've already spent combating climate change globally? Do you have an estimate for that?
I'm unaware of a reliable estimate, Senator.
Okay. Anybody here? I'll tell you, we had a witness that said it was about $5 trillion. So if your multiplier is accurate, we should have already seen about a $30 to $35 trillion economic benefit from that $5 trillion. By the way, in the Inflation Reduction Act here, supposedly we've got a little under $400 billion of energy credits and dollars going to what I would call green energy boondoggles. Goldman Sachs estimated that cost about $1.2 trillion. So we dramatically understate how much we're going to spend on this. What I would say a futile effort to try and hold back the tides. Dr. Schellenberger, I read your book, Apocalypse Never, and I don't want to summarize it for you, but I will. It seemed like you were making the point that economic progress and having a strong economy is probably the most important thing to concentrate on, in spending like $5 trillion to apparently have no impact on our environment because there's still, people still saying world's going to end in 12 years, is wasting limited resources. Does that pretty well typify your views?
Yeah, that's definitely one way of describing it. I think the way to think about this issue in general is around energy transitions. And we go from wood and dung to coal, hydro, oil and gas to nuclear. Each step along the way, those transitions are made by the new fuel becoming cheaper and more abundant than the older fuel. It's simply not the case that we got a transition from coal to natural gas by making coal expensive. We didn't have a carbon price. I mentioned that we did not pass Waxman-Markey cap and trade, and yet we reduced our emissions by almost 22%. That's the story everywhere in the world. So these economic models are very misleading in that sense. And just to make one other point here, the Chairman Whitehouse mentioned this IMF study. That is an absolute garbage study. And I assure you that Mr. Greenstone, I do not think that he agrees with that study. That study counted as a subsidy for fossil fuels the externalities of fossil fuels. It counted the externalities and relabeled them subsidies, and it did not count the benefits. So it was a cost analysis, not a cost-benefit analysis.
So let's talk about the costs of green energy. Let's talk about the cobalt mining in the Congo, utilizing child labor. Let's talk about the mining of other rare earth minerals. We don't even have close to enough currently to produce what's being envisioned. Can you just kind of speak to, I would call it the fantasy nature of what is being proposed right now and what's being imposed on our economy?
Absolutely. So the supply chains for renewables and batteries are a total human rights and environmental nightmare. Start in the Congo with cobalt mining, which is absolutely barbaric. Many people have seen the videos of people being buried alive. In China, the solar panels are being made predominantly by Uyghur Muslims in concentration camps. That's a part of China that the Biden administration says the Chinese government is committing genocide against the Uyghur Muslim minority there. That's how our solar panels are being made. The calculations on the carbon intensity of solar panels appear to be totally incorrect because they're based on a cleaner European grid rather than the coal-based China grid. So total nightmare. And then the other final problem with renewables is because sunlight and wind are energy dilute, it requires 300 to 800 times more land and significantly higher number of projects to produce the same amount of energy as you would from a nuclear or natural gas plant. That's why there's 8,000 solar, wind, and battery projects in the United States right now that are not hooked up to the grid because they can't get enough transmission because of all the different land use problems and regulatory and cost burdens associated with moving from energy dense to energy dilute fuels.
So I'm highly concerned about the corruption of scientific inquiries, scientific studies, because they're being funded by organizations, sometimes government, that know what they want in terms of result. Can you just kind of speak to the problem that we're experiencing in terms of, for example, scientific studies that can't be repeated?
Yeah.
The corruption, medical journals, these other scientific journals.
Absolutely. I mean, we need evidence-based policymaking, not policy-based evidence-making, and yet that's what we've seen here. And we've seen it with the IMF study, we've seen it in many other studies where people have an outcome in mind, like 100% renewables, and then they proceed along a course to do things like shutting down nuclear power plants, increasing carbon emissions, making electricity expensive, preventing poor people from having access to air conditioning. So you're absolutely right. We need to have evidence-based policymaking, not policy-based evidence-making.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.